So glad you could join me today for PJ's Storytime. I have another great tale I'd like to share with you. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who were very unhappy because they had no children of their own. They had much to make them happy: servants and gold and lands and splendid palace. But to them, the palace seemed a sad and dreary place without the sound of happy children's voices. At last, there came to the king and queen a beautiful little baby girl, and great was their joy. When the baby was 3 weeks old, she was christened, and to the ceremony were invited all the rich and grand and proud of the kingdom. And instead of just plain everyday godmothers, such as children have nowadays, the little princess had 7 fairy godmothers. And in the place of gifts, such as godmothers give to children nowadays, the fairy godmothers each gave to the princess a wish. A fairy's wish, you know, is the best gift that a child can have, for fairy wishes always come to pass. After the christening ceremony, the company returned to the palace where a great feast had been made ready for the fairies and guests. The fairies were all seated at the table. At each fairy's place, the king had set a golden plate and laid a knife and fork and spoon of pure gold. Just as they were seated, into the room walked an ugly old woman. She, too, was a fairy. Now, anyone who has ever seen a fairy has said that she was young and beautiful, but they can change their looks whenever they choose. And something had happened to displease this fairy, and she was angry with the other fairies, and had made up her mind to be everything that a fairy ought not to be. And so she was old and cross and ugly. She would not dance with the other fairies, and she had shut herself up in a tower, and had not been seen for 100 years. And the king had forgotten all about her, and had not asked her to be godmother to the little princess, nor had he invited her to the feast. She came into the room shaking her head and scowling at everyone. The king hastened to make a place and to set before her a golden plate, but he had no knife and fork and spoon of gold for her. She fancied that she had been slighted, and she sat at the table and muttered and grumbled in a low voice. The young fairy who sat next to her was troubled and feared that when the time came for the fairies to make their wishes, the old fairy might bestow an unlucky wish upon the little princess. And so, when the company rose from the table, she hid herself behind a curtain in order that she might speak last and undo as much as possible any harm which might be done by the old fairy. The fairy stood in a magic ring about the cradle where lay the little tiny princess, and each in turn made her wish. The first wished that the little princess might be good, the second that she might be beautiful, the third that she might be witty, the fourth that she might be graceful, the fifth that she might sing like a bird, and the sixth that she might dance like a fairy. And then suddenly into the ring stepped the old fairy, and in a terrible voice she said, "When the princess is 16 years old, she shall prick her finger on the spindle and die." At this, all the company began to weep. And then out stepped from behind the curtain the young fairy who had not yet made her wish. And she said in a soft voice, "O king and queen, I cannot undo all the evil wished. The princess shall indeed prick her finger on a spindle, but she shall not die. She shall fall into a deep sleep, and sleep for 100 years, until she is awakened by a prince. That this might not happen to the princess, the king commanded that all the spindles in the kingdom should be destroyed, and that anyone found spinning should be punished. And after a while, no one remembered the wicked fairy's wish. The years passed, and the little princess grew to be good and beautiful, and everything which the fairies had wished for her. One day, when she was 16 years old, she was walking in the wood, and she came to a very old house with a tower. The door was open, and she went in. She wandered through the rooms, and not finding anyone, she climbed the dusty stairs. She came to a little door. In the lock was a rusty key, and as she turned it, the door flew open, and there in the room sat an old woman spinning flax. "What are you doing, goody?" said the princess, for she had never seen anyone spin. "I am spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman. "Do let me try," said the princess. So the princess took the spindle from the old woman's hand and started spinning. But before the wheel had turned twice, she pricked her finger, and she fell to the floor in a deep sleep. The old woman was frightened. She tried to rouse her, and when she could not do so, she ran out for help, and people came running from the palace. But no one could waken her. When the king and queen heard what had happened, they were very much grieved. The princess was carried to the palace and laid on a bed in the most splendid room, and there she lay fast asleep. Then the king sent for the young fairy who had saved the life of the princess. She was far away, but she came at once in her magic chariot. The good fairy was very wise, and she thought of the time when, after 100 years, the princess would awaken, and that if she found herself all alone in the palace, she would be frightened and lonely. And so she waved her magic wand, and all in the palace, excepting the king and the queen, fell asleep. All the men and the maids, the ladies in waiting, the pages and footmen, fell into a deep sleep, each one just as he was. The cook fell asleep as he stood roasting the meat, and even the fire slept. The horses in the stable, the dogs in the courtyard, and even Mopsy, the prince's little spaniel, on the bed beside her slept. The pigeons in the courtyard tucked their heads under the wings and closed their eyes. The winds in the trees were still, not a leaf moved. No place in the world was ever so still as the palace where the princess slept. The king and the queen could not stay in the palace with all these sleeping people, and so they kissed their daughter and went sadly away. And then the good fairy caused a thick hedge of thorns to grow up around the palace so that no one could pass through to enter. Nothing could be seen of the palace but the very top of the towers, and that only from a long way off. And so they slept for years and years, and the young people in the kingdom grew old, and only the very oldest grandfathers remembered about the little sleeping princess. 100 years passed. One day, a prince from a neighboring kingdom came hunting with his men in the woods. He saw in the distance the towers of the palace. He asked what palace it was. Everyone whom he asked told a different story. Some said that fairies lived there, and others that witches lived there. But at last, the prince met a very old man who said, "O prince, my grandfather told me that a most beautiful princess lay asleep in the palace, and that she would sleep for 100 years until a prince should come to waken her. And now the 100 years have passed. The prince longed to see the beautiful princess and hastened toward the palace. When he came to the hedge of thorns, strange to relate, it separated and allowed him to pass through. But it quickly closed after him so that no one could follow. He came to the courtyard, and there he found the guards, drawn up in line, their spears in hand, all fast asleep. He spoke to them and shook them, but it could not waken them. He went into the palace, and there he saw sleeping pages and ladies in waiting. He passed from one room to another, and at last he came to the room where lay the princess, so beautiful that it seemed to him that she must belong to another world. Long he had looked at her, and then he stooped and kissed her. She opened her eyes and smiled at him and said, "Oh, my prince, have you come at last?" She was not in the least surprised to see him, because the good fairy had made her dream of him while she slept, and she knew just how he looked and how kind and good he was. And then everyone else in the palace awoke and went on with his work. The prince took the princess by the hand and led her down the stairs, and they went into the great hall of looking glasses and had supper. After supper, the prince said that his huntsmen and servants were outside the hedge, waiting for him, and that he must leave her, but that he would come again on the morrow. The next day the prince came with his father and mother to the palace, and the king and the queen thought that they had never before seen so lovely a princess, and they were filled with joy that their son had had the good fortune to find her and waken her. And the princess went with the prince to his kingdom, and there they were married, and they lived happily ever after. The end.